Good afternoon, everyone. As you look at this first slide, we have the quote from Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Your future health can be predicted by the nutrient density of your diet. And I just want you to think about that statement for a minute. Your future health can be predicted by the nutrient density of your diet. Now, that's a powerful statement. And it actually underscores the significant role that nutrient-dense foods play in our long-term health, particularly for individuals managing diabetes. Now, with this in mind, our session today will focus on practical ways to harness the power of those nutrient-dense foods. And specifically, we'll explore three main objectives to help you optimize your nutrition and manage diabetes more effectively. So the objectives are to incorporate practical strategies for optimizing nutrition and diabetes management, gain expert insights into or on the impact of food choices and blood glucose levels, as well as receive actionable tips for mastering meal planning, food choices, and portion control. Now, I always say we live in the land of the free. We have gluten-free, fat-free, sugar-free, and carb-free, if you will. And what happens is there are so many fad diets out there today, and people attempting to make our food more nourishing, as they say, or healthy. But when they do that, when we have all of these free products, they're actually not necessarily making things better. So I want you to think about what happens when we remove something from food. You know, what are the consequences of removing a nutrient? We look at gluten-free, for an example. We know that gluten-free products, unfortunately, are notoriously high in processed foods. So if they're making gluten, if they're making it gluten-free, they want to replace that with something else. They still want the food product to taste good, etc. So they're, adding starch, they're adding sugar, they're adding additional fat to it. We have items that are fat-free. If you ever look at a label, for an example, I'll use fat-free milk as an example, and you look at the carbohydrate content, you'll find that the fat-free milk actually has more carbohydrate than regular milk does. And the reason for that is when they take the fat out, they still want that milk to have a decent consistency to it. And so they're actually adding skim milk solids, which have more carbohydrate. And the same thing with sugar-free products that are sugar-free. They're taking the sugar out, but now they're adding all types of fillers and unhealthy fats into that product so that it still tastes decent, and also that it has the same mouthfeel. And then we have carb-free, and again, the same thing. So today, rather than talk about taking things out, taking nutrients out of food, we're going to look at the nutrient density, what nutrients we need to make sure that we're including in our diet. So rather than talk about subtraction, if you will, we're going to concentrate on addition. Okay, so we have our basic categories of nutrients. We have carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And these are what we call macronutrients. And macronutrients are nutrients that are essential for our overall health, for maintaining growth and development of the body. And the macronutrients give us calories, and we need them in large amounts. And this is one of the reasons that they're called macronutrients, because the body does require them in large amounts. So we'll be looking at each one of these categories as we go along. We also have micronutrients that we need for good health, but the micronutrients we need in much smaller quantities than the macronutrients. And those are our minerals and vitamins are the micronutrients. Now, today's session, we will not be going in depth looking at the micronutrients. Time will not allow that. So we are going to, as I said, concentrate on the protein, carbohydrate, and fat. But we also need water, so we've got to mention that. Water is essential for life. It helps us to maintain body temperature. It also helps to regulate blood sugar levels. It helps with transporting nutrients throughout the body, and also it helps as far as eliminating waste from the body. Oops. And we have alcohol as well. Now, the reason that I have alcohol here is not that we want you to drink, but just to highlight the fact that, like your macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, alcohol does provide calories. And that's important to note. So we don't need alcohol. We need everything else that's on the slide. We don't need the alcohol. But again, just to highlight the fact that it does have some caloric value to it or content. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, I mentioned the carbohydrates actually provide calories. You get 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. And there are several groups of carbohydrate. We have starches. And the starches are, you may have heard them referred to as complex carbohydrate. And the starches are really beneficial. They tend to have more fiber because they're complex. It's much slower in terms of digestion. So it really helps as far as regulating blood glucose levels. And you can see there's beans, there's grains. Sweet potato happens to be an example on the slide. Now, dairy also is part of the carbohydrate category. And as I mentioned with the milk, depending on whether it's whole milk or skim milk, it will have a little more, a little less carbohydrate. But there is carbohydrate in your dairy products. And it's not carbohydrate that's being added. It's not sugar added to dairy. Oftentimes people, when they look at the label, they think that the sugar that they see on that label associated with dairy has been added. But if it is pure milk, the sugar is what occurs naturally. And that is actually milk sugars, lactose that's in the dairy. Cheese may surprise you to see cheese on the slide, but hard cheeses have basically, we'll say, no carbohydrate, maybe a gram at the most, but it is your fresh cheeses that tend to have the carbohydrate, and that you do want to be aware of that. And that would be like cottage cheese. What's another? Soft cheese or fresh cheese. The cottage cheese is what comes to mind now. I can't think of the other cheeses. All right. And then we have fruit, which also has carbohydrate. And your fruit, the type of carbohydrate that you find primarily is fructose. So it's fruit sugar. Again, the same as with the milk. If you look at a label on fruit or you look up the nutrient content of fruit, you're going to see sugar, but that's sugar that is naturally occurring. It's not added sugar. And we have veggies. They're also part of that carbohydrate group. Generally speaking, preserving your vegetables have a lot less carbohydrate than your fruits and your dairy products. So if we say, generally speaking, a serving of fruit, about 12 grapes, is going to be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. On the other hand, a serving of vegetable is, if it's fresh vegetable, uncooked, about 3 cups would actually give you 15 grams of carbohydrate. So the veggies, you're able to eat a lot more for the same amount of carbohydrate. And then we have the processed foods, processed carbohydrates. And of course, when they're processing, typically they're adding a lot of undesirable things, such as fat and sodium, are added to those products. But they are part of that category of carbohydrate that we do want to be careful of our consumption and try to stick to the left of the slide as opposed to that last column. Now, we can't talk about carbohydrate without taking some time to discuss the glycemic index. And the glycemic index, it's a ranking of foods with carbohydrates on a scale from 0 to 100. And it's actually looking at how high we could expect glucose, blood sugars to spike or to go up after eating a particular food. So we have what's considered low glycemic foods, and these are foods that would give a smaller fluctuation in blood glucose and as well as insulin excursion as well. So the low glycemic is what you're looking for, and this is more like vegetables like broccoli and green beans, spinach, kale, lettuce. If we're talking about fruit, berries, or a lower glycemic index item, brown rice, um, as well as whole grain bread. And then we also have the medium, if you will, lower glycemic index foods. And again, the lower glycemic index foods tend to be higher in fiber. And because of that, that's what helps them to have that lower impact on the blood glucose. So you don't have that spike when you're eating those foods. And then, excuse me, high glycemic index, of course, those are items that you want to shy away from because the tendency is that they will cause your blood glucose levels to spike. So they cause that higher curve. The glycemic index is something that we mention. It is something that you can use from, we'll say, the broad sense, but it's very difficult to follow the glycemic index. One, because there's not a glycemic index for every food item that you may be eating. The other thing is that there is a great deal of variability, if you will, as far as how your body responds. So you may be eating an item and let's say it says it's low glycemic index, low on the glycemic index, but because of your digestive system, because of the way the food is prepared, it actually changes the glycemic index. So you may not get the response that you anticipate based on that glycemic number. So these are things that you do want to consider. As I said, in general, items that are lower on the glycemic index tend to be foods that are high in fiber. So it's probably a better way to look at the food items that you're eating, whether or not they have fiber in them, because that's what helps to bring the glycemic index down or to lower the response in terms of blood glucose levels. Okay, so that brings us to protein, fiber, and fat. And when we talk about fiber, there are two types of fiber, and most foods tend to have a mixture of the two types. So first we look at soluble fiber, and this is fiber that dissolves in water. And it creates a sticky bolus, if you will. And that actually is very important because that's what helps the body to clear Okay, cholesterol, for an example, from the system, it gets trapped into that bolus and it is cleared from the body. So nuts and seeds, beans, lentils, those are all examples of soluble fiber. Insoluble fiber, excuse me, acts like a sponge, and it actually helps to create bulk in the system, and that's what enables us to have a good motility, promotes regularity when we have insoluble fiber. And as I said, most foods have a combination of the two. So as long as we're eating a good balanced diet, we don't have to worry about, well, is this soluble or is this insoluble? We eat the foods that tend to be high in fiber and we'll be in good shape. Okay. Now, fiber does not provide calories. Let's go back to our fiber slide. You'll notice there's no mention of calories there. Fiber does not provide calories. It's actually the indigestible part of plant foods. And so there's, no calories that comes along with fiber. With protein, we do get calories, again, part of the macronutrients. So we get 4 calories per gram of protein. And you'll notice on this slide when we talk about protein, excuse me, it is not just animal protein. It's also, there's also plant-based protein as well. And what's recommended from the American Diabetes Association, and if we look at my plate and so on, the emphasis now is more plant-based as opposed to getting our protein from animal sources. Protein is made up of amino acids. They're what we call the building blocks of protein. Of course, we're not going to go into all of these amino acids, so don't get nervous when you look at this slide. It's just to mention the fact that we do have amino acids that we consider to be essential. These are amino acids that the body cannot make on its own. Must be obtained from food. We have our conditionally essential, and these are amino acids that if you're ill, for an example, if you're running a fever, there's a lot of stress on the body will look to these nutrients, these amino acids, to help as far as recovering from that illness. So we consider them conditional. Okay, so they become essential when there is a stressor on the body. And then the non-essential, these can actually be synthesized by the body from other compounds, and we don't need to worry about getting them directly from the diet. Now, the good news is that again, if we're eating a whole foods diet, a balanced diet, whether it's from plants or from animal protein, our body is able to use it and make sure that we're getting all of those essential amino acids. The question comes up oftentimes in terms of vegetarian, and depending on your age, you might have heard, years ago, we used to always say you have to be careful how you're combining your protein sources, your plant-based protein or your animal protein. But now we know that you don't have to focus on the amino acids in that way. What you want to focus on is eating a variety of foods. Whether you're vegetarian or not, you want to get a variety of foods and a variety of protein sources. And then we have fat. Excuse me. Now, fat is the most concentrated source of fuel coming to the body. And as you can see, you get 9 calories per gram of fat. That's double the calories that you're getting from protein and carbohydrate. And there's different types of fat. So let's look at that. We have unsaturated fats. And the unsaturated fats are what we consider healthier fats. They're divided into two subcategories. We have monounsaturated fats, and that's your olive oil, sunflower, fish oil. And then we have the polyunsaturated fats, soybean oil, corn, and safflower oil. And as I said, these particular fats are actually what we consider heart healthy fats. So we want to eat whatever fat we take in. Ideally, we want it to be unsaturated fat. We want to avoid saturated fats. The saturated fats are associated with heart disease. And we know that if you have diabetes, there is that increased risk for heart disease. So again, saturated fats, what we should be keeping as low as possible in the diet. And that's one of the reasons for looking at more plant foods as opposed to, as opposed to animal products. Okay, and coconut oil. There's still some controversy on coconut oil. It is plant-based, saturated. So if if you choose to use coconut oil, of course, the goal is to take it in mind, be mindful of how much you're using, smaller quantities on the coconut oil. And then trans fats. Now, trans fats, definitely you want to keep those out of the diet. Trans fats actually can increase the LDL, the bad cholesterol, and actually lower the good cholesterol. So these are artificial fats. They've been made by what they call the process of hydrogenation. And that actually is taking, if you will, an oil, liquid, unsaturated fat, and making it saturated by adding hydrogen to it. So these fats are solid at room temperature. If they're added to foods, generally it's going to be, processed foods, and you'll be able to look at the label to determine whether or not there is trans fat in that particular product. And the goal is no trans fats in the diet. So ideally, you'd want your label to be 0 or, and even if it's 0, it still may have a little bit. So it's not literally 0, but it's about as low as you can possibly get. Okay, then we have the omega-3s, and excuse me, these are monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, which are coming from fish, okay, from salmon, for an example. Mackerel, what we say the fatty fish, actually are good sources of omega-3. And the omega-3s are cardioprotective, so they actually help in terms of lowering LDL cholesterol. Also, they have anti-inflammatory action, which makes them particularly good for in cases of diabetes. And we want to make sure that we concentrate on everything in our nutrient-dense diet, but particularly make sure that we're including omega-3s as part of our fat intake. Helps with brain health, immunity, gut microbiome, as well as helping with our skin health, as well as cell integrity. Okay, so we want to bring it all together. We've looked at all of the macronutrients that the body needs, which foods are included in that category. And as I said, we want to think in terms of addition as opposed to thinking in terms of subtraction. Okay. So this is all those foods that we talked about, all the categories put on the plate. And this is what we call a healthy plate. This plate was actually developed by Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And it actually shows you what portion of the plate should be made up of various foods. So generally, if you look at this and you think, well, how much is plant-based? The majority of this plate is actually plant-based. 75% of it is plant-based. So again, pushing more plants, not necessarily a vegetarian diet, but a more plant-based diet is what is recommended. So all of this is all whole foods. Each one of the food groups, each one of the macronutrients that we mentioned, if you're eating this way, you will be getting all of those nutrients. You'll have what we call a nutrient-dense diet. Now, more specifically, in terms of diabetes, we tend to use a little bit of a different distribution, whereas we have half the plate for non-starchy vegetable. Of course, on the other plate that we showed, it is not specifically for people with diabetes, so it's looking at, as it's framed, a healthy plate and how to include all of those foods that we went over. With this particular plate, it's looking at it more in terms of carbohydrate, and to make sure that you're not overdoing it, or to help you so that you're not overdoing it. So half the plate is non-starchy vegetable. And this plate works well for many people, particularly for those that don't want to weigh and measure. They don't want to count anything, so they'll use the plate and distribute the food on the plate, and then know that they have a form of what I call repeatability. So for an example, you're eating your food distributed on this plate. You're going to have half of your plate non-starchy vegetable, your leafy greens, asparagus, and so on. The other half, you divide in half again. So you have quarter of your plate would be your starchy vegetables, your whole grains, potatoes, sweet potato, the beans, pasta. That's all part of the starch section. And then you have protein, which again is the other quarter of the plate. If you're distributing your food that way, you're always going to get repeatability. And so if you're checking your blood glucose 2 hours after eating that particular meal, and if it's higher than you anticipated, then you may say, well, maybe I need to eat a little bit less on this same plate. You're using the same plate. So it's just one way of getting repeatability to help you in terms of consistency with carbohydrate counting and having that nutrient-dense diet. Your fat is off to the side. Of course, it's healthy fat. Fruit is an addition. We always want to include fruit as part of that nutrient-dense meal, as well as dairy. But again, the plate method, people find that very helpful, particularly, as I said, with managing carbohydrate intake. Okay, so that helps as far as adding all of these foods that we went over, making sure that we're having that nutrient-dense meal. And the important thing to remember with all of this is that we've got to look at it from the practical perspective. We still want our meals to be enjoyable while we maintain the nutrient density of the meal. And it's important to remember that having diabetes doesn't mean that you've got to have everything bland and boring. It doesn't mean that you have to give up the foods that you grew up with. You still can include those foods. Now, you may have to make some small changes in order to, still have that same recipe. One other way of controlling that is even if you didn't want to make any change to your recipe, your favorite dish, control the portion. That is the other thing. Control the other foods that you have along with that meal. But the point is, you don't have to give up your favorite foods. You don't have to give up the foods you've grown up with. Okay, so cheese, low-fat cheese is one way of reducing fat. Cheese with strong flavors, so you'll need less because it does have that strong flavor. Uh, you do have to be careful if you're changing recipes with cheese. If it's fat-free, has no fat, it's not going to perform well in cooking and sautéing, that type of thing. So you do have to be careful how you're using it. I'm thinking of fat. I'm looking at fat, forgetting the other end of that says cheese. Okay. So, but yes, if it's fat-free cheese, it's not going to melt the same as if it's a whole milk cheese. Okay, so you want to go for a variety of flavors, textures, and colors. That also helps to make the meal more enjoyable. Cook your vegetables until al dente, and that's going to keep the color as well as the nutrient value. And you want to dress up your foods with herbs and spices, low-fat dressing, as well as grilling and roasting veggies. That's a nice way to keep the flavor, again, keeping the nutrient content as well. And then shop, cook, and eat with friends and family. That's very important in terms of making the meal enjoyable and also modeling for your children and making sure that you have that family time together, which is so important. And then you want to track your food and activity. I kind of hinted about this in one of the earlier slides, but it's so important. People oftentimes, mothers will say they're too busy. They don't have time to write down everything and to track everything. There are many apps that will help to make that a lot easier for you. Even if you don't do it all the time, if you take a couple of weeks and you say, okay, I'm going to track everything for this week, it will give you a good sense of what you're eating, how your blood sugars are responding to the food that you're eating. So it's the only way to really identify patterns and so on. So you definitely want to track your food and your activity. Okay. Okay, so by focusing on nutrient-dense foods, making informed food choices, you definitely can influence your future health, reflecting back to the slide in the beginning. You want to, use all the strategies that were mentioned, make sure you're getting all of your macronutrients. One thing that I forgot to mention, actually, and thank heavens it's here on this slide, what we call no naked carbs. Okay, so here you want to make sure that you're pairing carbohydrates with protein, fiber, and fats, healthy fats. And the reason for that is that it will slow down the absorption of, slow down the absorption of carbohydrate and therefore prevent that spike in your blood sugar. So you do want to remember that no naked carbs, as it's called. And it also reflects back to the glycemic index from the fiber perspective. Having diabetes, as I mentioned, doesn't prevent you from enjoying the foods that you've grown up with or foods that you may want to try. And the diabetes plate is really an easy way to control portions, to balance your nutrients, and manage your blood sugar levels. Okay, so I'd like to thank you. We've gone through a lot in a short period of time. The slides are available. You have a handout that is available on the website, as well as this is a summer recipe pack that I put together. It actually has some fun recipes in it that you may like to indulge in or try. So if you scan the QR code, or you can follow the link that is here, and you'll be able to download that recipe book. Okay. So
Good.
again, thank you for your attention, and time for Q&A.
Yes, thanks, Connie. And we did get quite a few questions in our Q&A, and for lack of time, I want to start the questions. So the first question comes from an anonymous attendee, and it says, how did the dietary recommendations change if you have fatty liver, like NASH, and type 2 diabetes?
Okay, so both, they asking, they have both conditions.
Yeah.
Okay. So pretty much the most important thing is watching fat, not having large amounts of fat, as well as concentrated sweets. So jellies, jam. So it's watching not just the amount of carbohydrate, but where that carbohydrate comes from. So again, jellies, jams, cookies, cakes, candy, that type of thing would need to be restricted. In more detail, ideally, the best thing would be to sit down with a dietitian to get more. The dietitian can get a better idea of exactly what's going on with you as an individual, looking at your labs, and adjust the diet based on that. But generally speaking, it's low in fat and low in concentrated sweets.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question comes from Elizabeth Ann. It's how much fruit can we have a day or per meal?
Okay, so from the nutrient perspective, you want to have 3 servings of fruit per day. You don't want to have it all at one time. It's best to divide it up, to have either as with the meal, part of your total carbohydrate for the meal, or as a snack between the meal. If you have it as a snack between the meal, remember, no naked carbs. So you want to combine it with something. So if you have a piece of fruit and you have nuts, or a piece of fruit and a little piece of cheese, or a piece of fruit and maybe you have a little piece of chicken left in the refrigerator from the night before, you just don't want to have the fruit by itself. Always pair it with protein or fat.
Perfect. And Elizabeth has another question. Does cheese count as a protein, fat, or dairy?
Counts as a protein and dairy. But from, when you look at your plate, if you're following, let's say, more of a plant-based, and this is a day where you're not having any animal protein, then the cheese would be counted more towards your protein. But it's still giving you the nutrients from dairy in terms of calcium, magnesium, and so on. So it actually kind of falls in both groups.
Very good. And anonymous attendee has said, this is such great information, and she would love the opportunity to strengthen her knowledge. And if she could have your contact, and I was just going to say your contact is in the slides, and we can also provide that. Another question comes from an anonymous attendee, and is, how is edamame categorized? Edamame, the soy, yeah.
Yeah, it's when you eat it that way, it's vegetable. It's a starchy vegetable that happens to be a good source of protein as well, but it's a starchy vegetable. So carbohydrate, we always want to be mindful of the carbohydrate, and that's what the edamame has.
Very, very good. Okay, I think that covers our one last question. I hear a lot about superfoods. Why do they call them superfoods? And what are some that really don't cost a lot of money?
Okay, so typically when you hear superfoods, it's referring to those foods that are more nutrient dense, that have, a lot of nutritional value to them. And it's pretty much everything that we talked about. It's really beans, legumes, whole grains. It doesn't have to be, whole grains that cost a lot of money, like I'm trying to think, quinoa. That's one that's more expensive than if you're having oatmeal, which is a whole grain, nutrient dense. So yes, you can get superfoods. You don't have to spend a lot of money. And I think the focus would be better, not in terms of superfoods, but in terms of whole foods. Everything that we went over today. I can't stress that enough.
Very good. And Connie, thank you for the wonderful presentation. One of our viewers also said, thank you. This is great information. And I mean, you presented kind of the basics, the ABCs, what some of those differences were, and loved your colorful, the food plates. I mean, you did a great job. So I just want to say thank you. And on behalf of all of our members, some of the upcoming events, we'll be kicking off a series of expert series and sponsored lifestyle webinars on the behavior of medication taking, with an in-depth focus on insulin in July. And we're going to have some very, very well-known speakers. So check the website and sign up. In August, Diabetes Sisters will be hosting a series of sponsored webinars related to weight management, including lifestyle issues, the medications related to weight management today. And Connie will be back talking about the basics and of some key weight loss strategies around some of those basic issues as well. So please remember to sign up. The webinars are always at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. These are all recorded and available on demand for your viewing pleasure. Connie's tip sheet and the recipes that she talked about will be available for download on our website as well. Again, a big thank you to Connie. We're looking forward to her next presentation. Thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you in July and well after that too. So thank you again. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a really nice day.